Hello and a warm welcome to our weekly Q&A on the Ukraine war with Professor Michael Clarke. As usual, hundreds of you have submitted your questions. We will try and get through as many as we can. If you want to submit questions as we go, do so. You can scan the QR code on the screen and we'll try and get to as many of those as we can in the next half an hour or so. Michael, let's get to it, shall we? There's kind of one big battlefield situation we want to talk about, Pokrovsk, and the kind of conflicting reports as to who's where and how much control the two sides have. Reports that Moscow's troops have made key advances there. Well, Gilson asks, what's the latest on the situation in the city? And when Bakhmut was captured, Gilson says, look, it didn't collapse the Ukrainian defence. If Pokrovsk is captured, what impact does that have?
Yeah, it's a good point. Let's deal with Bakhmut first, because the Russians spent almost a year trying to take Bakhmut, and that was the Prigozhin's Wagner group mainly, and that's the clue to it. The Wagner group said, we will take Pokrovsk, and they made that into a part of their power play within the Russian military at the time. They were trying to impress the Russian Ministry of Defense that they were the only group who really knew what they were doing, which was sort of true in a way. But Bakhmut had no strategic value. It was, or very little strategic value. It was actually a symbolic point, because when the Russians had taken Bakhmut, that was relatively close to the two places they really do want, which is Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. But the ground after Bakhmut was a series of rising plateaus, very heavily fortified. No Russian commander would sensibly start an assault on Kramatorsk from Bakhmut because of the nature of the ground. So Bakhmut had very little real strategic value, other than the symbolic value that the Ukrainians tried to pay, make the Russians pay very dearly for it, which they did. But eventually they had to leave. The difference with Pokrovsk is that Pokrovsk, although it's further away from Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, it's down in the south, but Pokrovsk is a genuinely strategic place because it's a road and rail hub. And if the Russians can take and hold Pokrovsk, then they've got access north. Although it's further, they can go north towards Kramatorsk, or first of all, Kostiantynivka, and then Druskivka, and then Kramatorsk-Slavyansk. And as we've said many times before, if they take Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the two northern fortress cities, of those four fortress cities, if they take those two northern ones, they've got the Donbas, which is ultimately what they want to do. They might try to take it from the north as well, from west of Donetsk, Lyman. And they've fought a lot around Lyman, and they might try to move south from there. But again, they've tried and not had very much success. Now, what's happening in Pokrovsk, as of yesterday, is that the Russians have got, they think, or the Ukrainians think, there's about 1,000 Russians who've infiltrated into the centre of Pokrovsk in these small groups, because they can only get through in small groups of 6s and 8s and so on. But they've got several hundred, let's say 1,000, probably no more than that, inside the centre of Pokrovsk. And if they could hold their position, if the Russians can hold these sort of little islands of positions they've got, it's quite a big place, Pokrovsk. But if they can hold them and then get some armour into them and solidify it, then they could force the Ukrainians to withdraw. And the Ukrainians withdraw to the west. I mean, they're cut off to the north and the south and the east. The Ukrainian avenue of withdrawal is only about 10 kilometres wide, which in military terms is not very wide. So the Ukrainians might have to give it up. However, the Ukrainians have devoted their Azov brigade, which is probably their best fighting brigade. They've already put that into Pokrovsk and held it. And they look as if they're putting in as many of their elite forces as they can spare from elsewhere. So the Ukrainians are certainly not giving up on Pokrovsk. But the danger is that they leave it too late, that they can't withdraw in good order, and they either withdraw in chaos, which they have done in the past, which they did from Avdiivka, for instance, or they leave it really too late and they get caught out and have to surrender.
Like we saw in Mariupol. But that was a different situation, I appreciate. But I kind of also guess this far into the war, Ukraine can't afford to have a Mariupol situation where
no, they can't.
That number of soldiers get left behind.
No, exactly. I mean, a chaotic withdrawal would be preferable to that. To an honourable surrender, because then a lot of people go into prison camps in Russia where they're very badly treated. We know that. So I think the Ukrainians have got probably a 50-50 chance of holding on to Pokrovsk, but it's tough for them. It's really tough because they just lack the numbers. And the Russians have got lots of numbers. There's not much firepower they can put behind the numbers at the moment, but they've got the numbers to get into Pokrovsk. And if they can solidify their position, they will. Equally, the Ukrainians are going to have to go in for urban warfare to throw them out, either to kill them or surround them or capture them or make them leave. And again, in a devastated urban landscape, that's a tough job. And only elite forces can really do that.
And I assume we look at the withdrawals of previous battles, there was generally a road, a corridor. And you talked about that 10-kilometre wide corridor, but there was generally a road. There was a relatively well-established way in and out. But the resurgence of drones, and drones now that are being operated by fibre optic cables that aren't jammable, means that even a single road now is not enough, isn't it? Because anything that moves up and down it, to your point, of the infiltration of little groups of 3 or 5 or 6, anybody moving up and down that road is a sitting duck.
Is a sitting duck, yeah. They have put, as I understand it, netting up. I mean, what the Ukrainians have been doing is putting high netting, sort of 20 feet high netting, either sides of the roads to try to prevent drones actually physically getting to vehicles passing through. It's a very crude measure, but it works in some places. And if they've got enough netting, they might give it a try. The other thing is that when troops withdraw, although they may leave their heavier equipment behind, troops can normally find their way out in little groups or individually. They just crawl out, in the undergrowth, as it were. They crawl out as best they can, and they just withdraw. It's not a great way to do it, but they can usually get out unless a lot of drones will spot them. But that's the point. The Ukrainians would much rather reinforce Pokrovsk and do something about the 1,000, let's say, Russians over there than have to withdraw themselves.
Well, that reinforcement takes us on nicely to a question Sophie Louise has asked, saying, I've read and seen reports of a group of Ukrainian special forces arriving by helicopter there, being, in inverted commas, taken out by a Russian attack. Sophie Louise saying both sides offering a different story. What do we know, if anything?
No more than that, I'm afraid.
Right.
The Russians say one thing, the Ukrainians say another. The Russian account is entirely plausible that if they were helicoptering special forces in, and that's the best way to get them in, but it's dangerous, of course, taking people in by helicopter because they've got a big radar signature by definition. But equally, the Ukrainians might have got them down and perhaps they lost a helicopter in the process. So the answer is I don't know. All we've got is these two conflicting accounts.
Let's kind of look a bit more expansively now. The targeting of Russia's oil and gas infrastructure has been key for Ukraine, as much as anything, to put pressure on just the economy of Russia. And they've been savvy in the use of drones and also Western-made missiles and rocketry to try and target some of these refining spaces. And so this is a question from LT. There seems to be two battles going on, one via strikes to energy and oil production and the other on the front line. Who's winning those two different areas of conflict, those refineries and the front line? And then, this kind of wider situation of you can build as many missiles and drones as you want to target refineries, but the actual fighting on the front line requires manpower.
Yeah.
And will Ukraine be able to keep that manpower sustained whilst it's also trying to fight this more remote war into sovereign Russian territory?
Yeah. I mean, overnight, the Ukrainians had quite a big success at Stolitomach, which is deep into, it's about 1,000 miles, I think, from the Ukrainian border. It's quite near the Kazakh border. And they got a big petrochemical plant and refinery on fire, which hadn't been targeted before, deep inside Russia. And also in Nizhny Novgorod, another chemical plant, which they hit overnight. They're achieving great success just with their own drones and their own armaments in hitting these things. And they're clearly creating a problem for domestic production of fuel in Russia, and diesel as well, which is what the armed forces use most. However, this is just like the argument in the Second World War, that you can do all you like to hit the homeland's fuel. The armed forces will still get the fuel they need.
But to the detriment of other people.
This is what Bomber Harris used to say. Bert Harris, who conducted the British bomber offensive in the 1940s, he said, we can starve the Germans all we like of fuel. The last drop of fuel will still go to the Wehrmacht. They will still get the fuel they need. And that is the case. So the effect of bombing the Russian refineries is big. I mean, Russia's production of domestic fuels and lubricants are also very important in this respect because they're absolutely vital to industry, and that's between 10 and 20% affected, quite badly affected now. So they've got a bit of a crisis in their domestic fuel market, and they're certainly not exporting any fuel, and there are shortages in a lot of places now, in all over Russia. And that is putting a strain on the economy, which the Russians will feel along with other strains on the economy next year, during the winter and next year. It's starting to bite now. So it's not without purpose that what the Ukrainians are doing. But will it win them the war? No, it won't. It will add to the pressures they're trying to bring on Putin to think again about a ceasefire. And if I had to give a simple answer, I'd say what would bring Putin to the table? One would be that domestic stress on the economy, and two is losing territory in Ukraine, to feel that his forces are being pushed back instead of forward. So on the ground, we're still in the situation where the Russians are moving forward very, very slowly, and they still haven't taken a major city. I mean, they took Kherson in the first days of the war in 2020 because it was basically given to them.
Yeah.
I mean, it was eventually surrendered to them by pro-Russian leaders. And then when they were thrown out of Kherson in the autumn of 2022, and they haven't taken another major city, not Sumy, not Chernihiv, Mariupol, which is an important city, but not one of the big major cities they did take after that great siege of Mariupol. But that was the last one. And so the Russians have got no chance of taking a big city. What they're doing is taking things that we would say are big towns or small cities. Of in the case of Pokrovsk, of some strategic value. So they can keep on doing that. I mean, if the Russians keep on going, will they get the Donbas? Eventually, yes, they will. And by eventually, I would guess, if nothing else changes in the spring or summer of next year, if everything goes the way, if everything continues to go like this, I would guess another season's fighting will probably give them the whole of the Donbas if they're prepared to keep going. But things may also change. And we also have to remember that the Ukrainians are keeping themselves alive because they've won a strategic victory in the Black Sea. You know, they control the western part of the Black Sea. They're getting their ships in and out at pre-war levels now from the ports of Odessa and Chornomorsk.
Feels like a long time ago since we were talking about grain deals and
That's right.
Recep Tayyip Erdogan and all of that. You know, it's a very different picture there now.
And all that the Russians can now do to try to prevent that lifeline, economic lifeline, is try to bomb the docks in Odessa and Chornomorsk, which they are doing. I mean, there's another big strike last night. So they're trying to destroy the ports from which all these things are loaded. But again, that takes time, and the Ukrainians can always improvise the sort of port facilities that these ships need. So, I mean, the war is dynamic. It's at a stalemate in one respect, but it's dynamic in another. That the Ukrainians are doing well in the Black Sea. They're doing quite well economically. They can probably get by through this winter. It's going to be really tough for them, but they've got more independent generating capacity, you know, literally lots of generators. They're linking themselves into the West European energy grid relatively successfully. So they'll probably be able to get through. But if the Russians continue this grinding offensive, and if they're prepared to take another 500,000 or 1 million casualties by, let's say, September next year, then they'll probably get the Donbas. So that's how I would assess where the war is at the moment.
Remarkably tragic figures. 500,000 to 1 million casualties.
Over 1 million now. But by casualties, we should say that's dead and
injured.
Wounded. And what we mean by wounded is life-changing wounds. Wounds that take you away from the battlefield, not wounds that you can go to a hospital and then go back to the battlefield in a month, which a lot of wounds are like that. But these are wounds that take you off the table, as it were, as a fighter. So casualties, significantly over 1 million now for Russia, and about, we think, maybe 300,000 to 400,000 for Ukraine.
And there's a military doctrine, isn't there, that works in the idea that, in some respects, casualties are actually a better way of seizing up an offensive force, because you know most decent militaries, if that's going to be the turn of phrase, you have an injured soldier, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 look after it. Yeah. The Russians see it in a different way, and wounded will probably carry on going. So casualties kind of they're both the same in the mindsets of many of those Russian generals.
You know, Gareth, that's one reason why these horrible things, anti-personnel landmines, which have been banned, of course, in the 1997 convention, as now people are lifting that ban because they think they need them. But anti-personnel landmines are not designed to kill people.
No.
They're designed to blow your leg off or your feet off, or do significant damage, because a badly wounded person on the ground then requires attention. Yeah. And it can take 4 soldiers to carry a stretcher with a badly wounded person out of the battlefield. And very often, of course, in traditional wars, there's no shortage of people offering stretcher duty, because it gets them out of the front line for a while. I'll go, sir, I'll go. And 4, I'll take him. And then, of course, you've got to persuade the stretcher bearers to get back into the front line once they've taken them to a dressing station.
But one butterfly mine has taken out 5 people out of that fighting force.
Absolutely.
Talking about fighting forces, you reference seasonality. It is the 4th of November. Winter is starting to really kind of probably set in parts of Ukraine now. Himalaya wants to know, is winter likely to favour one side over the other at all, or is it, they're both fighting on the same battlefield, so it affects them equally?
In general, winter favours defence over attack. If you're on the defensive, then you're dug in wherever you are, and you don't have to move. You just have to hold your position. If you're attacking, you have to keep moving. And you're moving forward, you've got to establish new positions, so the ground is harder to work on, as it were, harder to dig in if you're trying to dig in. And in winter, it seems like a trivial point, but it's not. You lose leaf cover. In a place of lots of forests and trees, if you're in the middle of them in the summer, then you are relatively invisible, except to when you start to think of infrared sensors. But you can't easily be seen. In winter, you can be seen much more easily. Moving around in winter, particularly the snow on the ground, then you've got where you've got to have white uniforms, winter uniforms. I mean, uniforms, standard combat stuff stands out a lot when there's snow on the ground. So in general, winter favours the defence. It's miserable for everyone. The other thing that winter does is it prioritises or favours the side who is better trained. So armies that are better at dealing with winter, and the Ukrainians are much better than the Russians at doing this, then they will survive the winter better. And it comes down to things like, I mean, again, this goes back to the old First World War. Infantrymen know how to look after their feet.
Yeah, boots.
Got to look after your feet. Yeah, if you get wet and your feet get if your feet stay wet, then you'll end up with problems. And trench foot, of course, became a famous problem. And that's a modern problem. I mean, it's been seen in modern warfare as well. So good infantrymen know how to look after their feet and their socks and their boots, because they're properly trained and they've got people nagging them, their sergeant nagging them to do it properly. And a poor army, they leave it to individuals, and some individuals are too foolish to do it, so they get taken off the front line. Maybe they want to be, but they end up with problems. So winter establishes particular issues for all armies. And those armies who are trained and can cope with it better will come out better. So in general, the winter's going to be better in this case for the Ukrainians.
Yeah. And one would think that Ukraine's Western backers will make sure they've got the equipment and the snowsuits and whatever material it's needed to just keep people warm and dry, let alone all the rest of it.
And a lot of effort has been put into that, helping them get through the winter. I don't know what supplies are like at the moment, I have to say, but in previous winters, a lot of effort went in, particularly from our European partners who have bigger armies, sending the Ukrainians the sort of equipment they needed.
Talking just briefly about kind of being on the offensive during winter and moving around a battlefield, there's no, from an offensive perspective, you kind of hope it freezes solid so you can get around, but there's no guarantee of that depending on what winter does. And lots of people will have seen the metal cages that the Russian tanks and armoured personnel carriers, etc., built over the top of themselves, those cope cages.
Cope cages, yeah.
And there's been a development in those now where they're taking lengths of metal rope and untwisting the metal rope, attaching that to the cope cage, so you've now got this kind of additional anti-drone barrier. And it's a pretty crude method, but you've got a long metal cable this wide that's splayed out. Your little drone that you bought off the shelf smashes into it. It keeps the explosion even further away.
Yes.
But what it also does is weigh down your tank.
Slows you down, makes you clank all over the place. I mean, some of this is Mad Max. Yeah. It's pure Mad Max.
But when it's warm and dry, you can probably get away with it.
Yeah.
When the mud's this thick. And all of a sudden your tank now weighs 3, 4, 5 tons more than it did previously. Yeah. Your offensive capabilities, you could potentially become just a sitting duck.
Yes, yeah, you can.
And that's where weather can just change everything.
That's the problem. I mean, armoured vehicles have had a really tough time this last 12 months because of the drones. And the weather now will give them a tougher time as well. The moment the weather is going colder, it's not especially wet in the autumn, but it does get very soft, and then it freezes, which is good for armoured vehicles to get over tough ground. But then the Rasputita is the period in the spring, which is mud. And that's when you get the rains and the mud. And then armoured vehicles have a really tough time because they have to stick to the roads, which makes them very, very vulnerable. And as you say, all this Mad Max stuff, which has been put onto armoured vehicles, is not great during the winters. It's a mixture. How much do you want to protect yourself from drones, and how much do you want to make your vehicle vulnerable in other ways by slowing it down, making it very obvious, and so on.
And axles and all of the mechanisms are designed with the original build in mind, not then with all these extra tons of potentially of kind of defensive.
I mean, a tank is 70 tons in the first place, and you put a ton and a half of metal on the top of it, which clanks around and gets caught on things. It's not going to help.
Not at all. Let's kind of move away from the battlefield if we can. French troops last month raiding that kind of Russian shadow fleet, arresting the captain. On that, we've had a question from Tom, who says, you predicted something would happen at sea as part of the pushback to Russia by Europe. So do you know what happened to the shadow fleet vessel that was intercepted and raided by France a couple of weeks ago?
It was the Boracay, it was called. And the suspicion was that it was acting as a mothership for launching drones for those air incursions that we saw in late September, early October.
Into Europe.
That's right, into Europe, sorry, up in the Baltic states. I think it were drones in Poland and then a series of drones over airports in the Baltics. And Denmark, wasn't it? Denmark and Sweden. And the suspicion was that the Boracay was acting as the mothership because, getting drones this far into Western Europe would not have been possible by air without them being spotted. So they had to have come from something seaborne. The Boracay was intercepted. It was taken in. And my last information, this was about beginning of October, I think, 1st of October, maybe 30th of September, 1st of October, sometime like that. And my last information was that it was released and it went on its way south into the Mediterranean, I think. And the French have not prosecuted anybody. They detained some of the crew, and they sent some of the people home, I think. But the Boracay has been released. So either they didn't find anything, they didn't find what they're looking for. So it's fairly unsatisfactory from a Western point of view. However, they are establishing the principle that the Western nations are prepared to challenge some of these ships, the Dark Fleet, which most are unregistered, or they're registered in ways that makes ownership very difficult to trace, or they're not properly insured or uninsured completely. And I remember I was talking to some British officials about this, and I was saying, rather naively, why don't Western nations just seize them and bring them in?
Well, you could seize all the oligarchs'
and then
so why not these?
And then we'll go through their insurance papers, and we'll go through their cargo, and we'll have a look at all the irregularities and their safety features. And these officials said to me, that's fair, but we thought about that some years ago when the Iranians started using the Dark Fleet to transport their oil. And the problem then was, if we start doing that, they'll start seizing other ships. It'll be quid pro quo, and you could start a much bigger maritime conflict. And that's true, and I have to accept that point. However, I would take the view that this is a different security situation now, and Western navies control the Eastern Atlantic, the Western Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Baltic Sea. We're in control. Our navies are, and so I don't see that even with a response from Russia that we need to be too frightened about that by taking a much tougher view of these Dark Fleet ships sailing through the Channel.
Because the argument around Iran makes more sense when you think about the control of the Strait of Hormuz and the flow of oil and that pinch point, that global pinch point, that if you don't go that, then you go via the southern route, and it adds cumulatively, it would be billions. So,
and if you're talking about the Gulf of Oman, which ships did we have in the Gulf of Oman to do anything about it if they did seize a ship? Well, one or two at most. But if we're talking about the Atlantic seaboard, if we're talking about the Bay of Biscay or the Western Mediterranean or the Channel or the North Sea, between us, we've got about twice as much military shipping as the Russians anyway. And so what are they going to do if we stand up to them? That would be my view. Now, I know I'm taking a very assertive stance here, but this Dark Fleet is anything from 400 ships to 1,400 ships, which is to say that a lot of ships go into the Dark Fleet for a while and do a couple of voyages and then go back onto the legal trade again. And they flip-flop, changing their ownership every few months. So they're really hard to track and really hard to keep tabs on. We are now at the point, using AI and modern forensic techniques, of knowing what these ships are doing. And the figure, it's either 400 or 1,400, is nearer to the 1,000 mark than it is to the 400 mark. So if we know what the physical vessels are, and we've got a pretty good idea when they're on a Dark Fleet mission, why don't we intercept them, pull them in, and give them a really good going over for all the legal sides? And if they're clean, then fine, let them go on. That would be my view. And if it provokes retaliation from Russia, then we ought to be capable of dealing with that, is my own view.
Let's let's kind of move on to a situation that, we go through these cycles with Ukraine of kind of the weapon of the moment.
Yeah.
There's always a kind of a platform, whether that's the 8 tanks, whether that's the F-16s, whether that's the weapon, whether it's the HIMARS or whatever. There seems to kind of go, and there's a seasonality about it. There's almost that narrative that the next thing will be the thing that unlocks something.
Yeah.
And
the word game changer always
game
comes up.
changer.
It's got to be a game changer.
It's the silver bullet, etc. But Tomahawks much talked about. Obviously, we've got a question from Otendek Philip saying, "Do you think Trump made a mistake by not giving the Tomahawks?"
Well, not by his thinking, because he's been back and forth on this. He's been around the same thing at least twice, saying no, he wouldn't, then he would, then he wouldn't, then he would. Now he wouldn't. So we're into a sort of a different iteration now. So we're at the beginning of the third cycle of yes and no's, I suppose, as of this last 48 hours. And the thing about Tomahawks is that the Russians are clearly worried about them. They worry about the range and the accuracy. Now, there are other ways that the Ukrainians have shown with their own systems, drones, and the Flamingo flying bomb, in effect, like a V-1 flying bomb. It's got the same range as a Tomahawk. It's not as accurate. But the Russians worry about Tomahawks, not because so much of the range, but because of the accuracy.
Yeah.
And they carry a pretty big
hard
warhead.
to intercept.
Yeah, exactly. Hard to intercept because they fly pretty low. I mean, literally somewhere between 30 and 50 meters over the ground. Not very fast, about 600 miles an hour, the speed of a civilian airliner, but they're hard to shoot. Not impossible, but they're hard to shoot down.
And I guess if you've got your land hearing or radars at this angle,
they fly under the radar,
sneak underneath it, or at least when it's finally in the range of the radar, it's now too close to be able to do anything with.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And at the time when it then gains height, as it's very near a target, it then climbs to a height so it can drop onto the target if it wants to go in at the top. But if it wants to go in through a window, then it'll go in through a particular window. So it's the accuracy of them that really worries the Russians. They would have. If the Americans had been prepared to give enough Tomahawks to Ukraine, and by enough, I'm guessing 200 or something like that, so that the Ukrainians could really go after Russia's refining capacity, military targets, then I think that would have made a difference to Russia's thinking about continuing the war into next year.
Well, is that why the phone rang from Putin?
Yeah.
Because he was concerned
Putin was worried
to try and
enough
nip
about
that in the bud.
Absolutely. And he frightened Trump into backing off by saying, we will hold you responsible, in effect. If we see Tomahawks coming, we will assume that there are Americans behind it. There are Americans guiding it. The Americans are on the ground in Ukraine. That's rubbish, incidentally. But that's what he said. And he was obviously forceful enough to make Trump nervous about doing this. So Trump, having boasted about doing it and he said, "Oh, how would you feel, Vladimir, if I gave them 1,000 to 2,000 Tomahawks?" He didn't like that. That's how I put it to him. That's what he said. He said on one of the phone calls. And clearly, once Putin had finished with him, then he was actually quite nervous about it. And I think that's probably going to be the way of it for the future. I don't think Trump will change his mind again unless he really wants to come back into this war, which I don't think he does. I think he's on his way out. Having said that, the Ukrainians can substitute for it to a degree. The Storm Shadow doesn't have anything like the same range, but can do the same sort of job, so 500-600 mile range, Storm Shadow and Scalp. The French have got a Navy version of Scalp, which is much longer range, which they might benefit from. And this Flamingo drone, which the FP5, which the Ukrainians have produced themselves, has the same 1,500 mile, 1,500 mile range, and it carries a big warhead. It's about a 1-ton warhead, the Flamingos. So if the Ukrainians can produce enough Flamingos in the next year, then that would do the job that they're presently thinking Tomahawks might do. So if they can hang on, if this war goes into next summer, the Ukrainians might find that they've got really quite a big advantage in the ability to produce Flamingos. But you can bet your life the Russians are looking for these Flamingo production sites with all of their aerial bombings, which is why some elements are now being produced in Europe to help them. But the Russians will be desperate to stop Flamingo going into really big production.
It's a hell of a name for a warhead, isn't it? I'm just interested, you talk about the two of them being on the phone. It's a question that I don't know if you'll know the answer to, but I'm always curious. Putin only ever speaks in Russian. When he's on the world stage, only ever speaks in Russian. He can speak very good English. And there's one or two, if you search for them well enough, videos of him doing so.
Yeah.
What do we reckon? That 2.5-hour phone call? Is it Russian to English, English to Russian, back and forth? Or do you think he speaks to Trump in English?
My guess, I don't know. So my guess is he would do it through a translator in order to make the point. But
he
certainly
understands everything.
English very well.
And actually, there's that moment when they're in Alaska where he meets him on the red carpet. There's no translators there at all, and they are having
and
a
they
conversation.
clearly have a conversation.
Yeah, and they're in the car together.
Yeah, and they say, I mean, apparently Putin's spoken English is a little bit stilted, but clear enough. It's foreigners' English, it's fair enough. But he understands English pretty colloquially. So there's no problem there. And he has this advantage, which he, and like an old KGB man, he keeps it to himself because, people forget that he can understand what they're saying if they speak in English across him or in front of him. And I suppose if he wanted to get on very personal terms with Trump, he would speak English. But I think there's translators involved in it.
Interesting. Let's kind of move on to this question, which is always that perennial thing, especially when you think of like arms dealers and arms sales and arms companies and countries that are trading and what have you. This conflict has brought in everybody in many respects. We talk about even the South Koreans supplying shells to other European countries, so the European countries can send their shells to Ukraine.
155, yeah.
The NATO standard, the 155 mil shell. It's not just European situation, it's globalized. And with that, Mark S says, are any countries gaining from the war, or any important people or companies benefiting from this? Is there a sense that people benefit from it carrying on? And Anna C, kind of to a similar point, China, what does it benefit? Is it the political distraction? Is it the fact that everyone's looking at opposite direction? Is it the fact that it is supplying some components to Russia? And who's the beneficiary of this? Because people do benefit from war.
Oh, they do.
There's
Yeah,
big
war
money.
always benefits somebody. Yeah. And of course, there's a whole generation of, particularly my generation, 60s generation of conspiracy theorists who always said, wars are driven by all the arms merchants, the merchants of death. They make wars happen because it's good sales for them. It's not really true. The point is that when wars happen, the international economy punishes the area by ignoring it. When there's a war in a certain area, the international economy just goes around it. So structurally, everybody loses from an area of warfare, structurally. But individual nations and companies can do very well out of it, as particular beneficiaries. So, any number of companies are doing well out of this war, as they did out of Iraq and Afghanistan and
Second World War, you name it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, and there is a great move now, of course, in the Western world to rearm. So the Europeans are rearming. The United States is upping its armaments and its defence expenditure. So the big arms companies are now moving to, they're producing so much new stuff, but they're producing more of everything they've done over the last 20 odd years. So they're upping their production levels. And the people, the new entrants who are doing well on these are the small, medium enterprises, the innovative people who've suddenly found that if they can produce their material and get it into a big arms company, the arms company can see the value of it, and suddenly they become, their company's doing very, very well almost overnight. So yes, of course, there are always companies themselves. Countries, the Chinese are doing very well out of this war in two ways. One is that they are doing well out of it. It's been good for their economy because they're selling so much stuff now to Russia. They say they're not. They say they're just ordinary civilian components, but we all know they're not. They're dual capable, as they say. They're useful because a lot of missiles work on the same sort of processes that go into a domestic fridge. They're not. Most of this stuff isn't that sophisticated. Some bits are very sophisticated. Most of it is standard components to make electrical systems work. So the Chinese are doing very well in terms of an economic boost, and the political reason that the Chinese are having a useful experience with this war is that it distracts the Europeans, it splits Europe and America increasingly, and that's all to their advantage, and it increases their concentration on what they're going to do. Everybody thinks about Taiwan, which is true, but also the South China Sea. Look at how aggressive. The Chinese being in the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands. They're getting into
Scarborough Shoal. It's very rare that Scarborough's fought over as well. But
absolutely, the Scarborough Shoal as well. Fiery Cross Reef, Mischief Reef. All these reefs were named by 19th century British mariners who first of all discovered them, or named them, put them on the maps. So they've all got very British names. And so all of the Chinese are really pushing in the South China Sea, and the world is distracted. And the Chinese, I think, feel it's useful for them to keep Russia involved with its European partners, splitting the United States off. So that this war has a very useful purpose for the Chinese, and they claim, of course, that they're neutral, that they want it to end, but they don't. And they are determined they won't let the Russians lose. On the other hand, they might live with the idea that the Russians have to come to a ceasefire. I think they would live with that. But they won't live with the idea that Putin is totally humiliated and removed as a result of losing this war in some significant way. They'll do a lot to prevent that happening. So they're a big beneficiary. Iran has been a big beneficiary, but interestingly, the Iranians are now trying to distance themselves a bit because they've got other problems following the US attack and the issue that problems that they're in with the region of the Middle East. They now are leaning away, it seems, in the last 2 or 3 months, certainly since the summer, since June, from their closer relationship with Russia.
Iran maybe feels, as a result of the last year or so, that geopolitically it's slightly overextended. And now has been
You're right.
clipped back.
They're overextended, and they took some big hits from the Israelis and then from the Americans, and that has, as much as everyone criticised the United States for bombing the nuclear facilities, at the time that they did it, and whatever the effect has been, which we still don't really know, it has had quite a big political effect in Tehran, and the Iranians are reassessing their role in the region, and for that reason they don't want to get so close to the Russians.
Having an expeditionary mindset and strategy is all well and good when your economy can support it as well. And when you've been subjected to crippling sanctions for years, that also then you kind of when you also have a domestic population that you need to keep in check, what are you going to prioritise? Well, it's probably the grip on power at home first and foremost, and then the region, then, in tiers beyond that.
Gareth, a lot of people say in the wider discussions, sanctions don't work. Look at these countries that have been sanctioned for years, but they're still there. Well, that's true. But then look at how much effort they put into trying to get sanctions lifted, and look at the effect that sanctions do have on the legitimacy of their government or the ability of their government to deliver the things they need to deliver. The Russians have put immense efforts into trying to get sanctions lifted, and so have the Iranians. And in the Iranian case, the sanctions now, the European sanctions have snapped back. As in early October, this was part of the old nuclear deal of 2015, the Iranians have not now observed the deal for reasons that are understandable from their point of view, and so European sanctions have snapped back, which they didn't want, and are causing a lot of problems for Tehran itself.
2 final questions. One, for a lighter finish, we'll get to the end. I've given you a heads up, so you've had a bit of thinking time for that final question. About Hollywood. You've had a bit of the heads up for that one already, so you've had some thinking time for that. This one, actually, I really like. It's from Jack F. He says, "Hi, I'm 17, and at school we're taught to always look at things in the media without bias. There is no doubt that Russia's evil and incomprehensible war crimes are occurring, but is Ukraine committing anything similar, and are we aware of it?"
Yes, in a minor way, and yes, we're aware of. I think we're aware of pretty well all of it. I'm not sure. In the early days, there was video that I saw of Ukraine unloading some Russian prisoners from a vehicle, and they just shot each of them in the leg. As they unloaded them, just pistol shot in the leg. That's a war crime.
Yeah.
That's mistreatment of prisoners. They didn't kill them, but they shot them in the leg to immobilise them, one by one, and it was brutal to watch. And the Ukrainians have used their prisoners in the early days. They used them for propaganda. Again, you shouldn't parade prisoners in front of cameras. It's not so much a war crime, but it's against the laws of war. Do I believe that the Ukrainians have committed crimes? Yes, of course. Armies do, and when they're fighting with this sort of viciousness, they do. By and large, they come to light. They do come to light, and we shouldn't get the idea that the Russians are barbaric in the way that they're fighting in lots of respects.
Even in the way they treat their own people, let alone the enemy.
It's a different, they have a different sort of mindset in fighting. And the Russians do involve civilians. It's part of their war doctrine. They don't advertise it, but part of their war doctrine is civilians are all part of the battlefield. They're not to be excluded from the battlefield, as in the Geneva Conventions. They're part of the battlefield. And that's the way they operate. Are the Ukrainians blameless? No, of course they're not. But they are. But journalists are moving around. Western journalists from all over the world are moving around inside Ukraine. They're not inside Russia. Only Russian journalists are moving around in the Russian areas. So journalists are there. They can see what they can see. The Ukrainians are not blameless, but it's nothing like the extent of both daily systemic war crimes and individual acts against the laws of war that we see all the time on the Russian side.
So this is the final question, a Hollywood question.
That, yes.
KB, does Professor Clarke have a favourite war film, first part, and second part, which is the most realistic?
All right, my favourite war film is The Dam Busters.
Yep.
Book by Paul Brickell. But one of the reasons I think it's such a wonderful film is because the screenplay was done by R.C. Sheriff, who's a very celebrated playwright, wrote Journey's End, for instance, about the First World War. And when you see that film, that film has made me the sort of for good and bad, the sort of person I am. I spent my whole life trying to be Richard Todd being Guy Gibson, who commanded the Dams raid, because it's full of understated heroism. And it is the dialogue is spare and careful and clever and deeply, deeply moving. And cinematography, in terms of cinematography, the special effects aren't great. The actual explosion on the dams isn't great. But everything about it dramatically is just wonderful. It's a fabulous, fabulous film, I think. It's a lesson in really good quality filmmaking. Most realistic war film, I think, is probably the first 30 minutes of Saving Private Ryan, which is the attack on Omaha Beach and on D-Day, where the Americans had such a problem. And the commander in Omaha said, as he's moving through his troops, they're all pinned down. He said, "Son," he said to all of them, he said, "Son, there's only two sorts of men on this beach: those who are dead and those who are going to die. Get off the beach." They had to move off the beach. And they're pinned down for 3 or 4 hours. And the depiction of that in Saving Private Ryan it's gruesome, but it's terrifically realistic. It's full of little details, like the way bullets shoot through the water. Men are under the water. They're bailed over the side of the landing craft just to get out of the way, and bullets are penetrating the water with this zip. It's full of those details. And the other element of Saving Private Ryan, which is staying in that first part, after the first 30 minutes, it becomes a much more conventional war film, which is still pretty good, but it's conventional. But the other bit that I always struck by is that when Tom Hanks is the captain, after they've taken Omaha, we then see it 3-4 days later, and he comes back, he's ordered back to the beach, where he's given the task of finding this guy called Ryan somewhere on the battle area and bringing him out. And Tom Hanks acts beautifully because he's a captain of the Rangers. He's got his platoon. He's been fighting for 3 days after that awful beach that awful beach assault, and he's just indifferent. He doesn't care. He's tired. He's got the 1,000-mile stare. He does his job. He reacts to people, but his reactions are typical of a soldier who's just wants to get this over. And I think it was a brilliant piece of acting. And it's not much in what he says. It's his face and his attitude and his body movements. And I thought, gosh, that is what it feels like, I'm sure, to come back after 3 days of operations when you can't even stand up. There were cases in the First World War where men came out of the front line after a big push, as they called it. And they do say 24 or 48 hours for the big push. And then they'd be withdrawn from the line and a new unit would go in to follow up the gains. And when those men came out, they were like zombies. And they said when they got back to their holding area, they just marched back half a mile or a mile or whatever. And some of them, if you just pushed them gently, they'd fall over on the ground and they'd fall asleep. They just wouldn't be able to get up, and they'd be asleep within 2 or 3 seconds. Sheer nervous exhaustion.
Yeah. I'm gonna give a nod to the Dam Busters because my late great-grandfather Ken made part of the release mechanism for the bouncing bomb. As an engineer.
Yes.
Also, the search water radar pods on the side of Seeking helicopters was involved in kind of all sorts of things engineering. So I'll give a little nod to Dam Busters. But I think the two for me, 1917, just the way it was shot, beautiful cinematography there. And then
the illusion of a single tracking shot for the whole film. It wasn't, but it looked like it.
It was very cleverly done. And then the late, great McQueen in The Great Escape. Just, a different war film, telling a different story, but one.
I like Luft 3, yeah.
One that, that final scene where he jumps the motorbike up on the grassy embankment to try and get underneath the barbed wire, and then you then see the stories of those that did escape, and kind of the fact it's based on a true story as well, I think.
And Big X, as they called him, Roger Bushell, who with 50 of them was murdered by the Gestapo.
Yeah. And that's that final couple of frames of that film, isn't it? Is kind of telling the story of those that were murdered by the Gestapo. Yeah. That scene of them at the railway station and the shout in German to get down and the shoots in the back of the remarkable films. Michael, always a pleasure. Plenty more from you as ever throughout the course. I have the pleasure of speaking to you every day. But I only normally get 4 to 5 minutes to do it. To do so for the last 45 has been an absolute treat, so thank you so much. Thank you as well. If you've sent in any questions, queries, thoughts, concerns, whatever, always delighted to hear from them. There'll be plenty more from Michael, same time next week and throughout the week as well on Sky News Today. Stick with us.